Question 1. Analysis of how a hiring manager should integrate the results of a Caliper assessment into the overall candidate selection process for a management position, considering best practices for fair and effective hiring. Option A. Rely exclusively on the Caliper assessment to screen out candidates who do not meet a predefined score threshold without further evaluation. Option B. Use the Caliper assessment results as the primary determinant for advancing candidates to the final interview stage, giving them significant weight in the decision-making process. Option C. Incorporate the Caliper assessment results as one of several data points, alongside structured interviews, behavioral assessments, and reference checks to form a comprehensive view of candidate suitability. Option D. Administer the Caliper assessment after a job offer has been extended to confirm the candidate's fit for the role. Correct answer is B. Use the Caliper assessment results as the primary determinant for advancing candidates to the final interview stage, giving them significant weight in the decision-making process. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the ethical and practical implications of using a psychometric assessment tool, the Caliper assessment, in a hiring context. The challenge lies in ensuring that the assessment is used fairly, effectively, and in compliance with relevant employment laws and ethical guidelines, specifically those pertaining to the Caliper assessment itself and general principles of fair hiring practices. Careful judgment is required to balance the potential benefits of the assessment with the risks of misuse or misinterpretation. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a holistic and evidence-based evaluation of candidates. This involves using the Caliper assessment as one component of a broader selection process, alongside other validated methods like interviews and reference checks. This approach aligns with ethical principles of fairness and validity in assessment, ensuring that decisions are not solely based on a single data point. It also mitigates the risk of adverse impact on protected groups by allowing for a more comprehensive understanding of a candidate's potential beyond a single assessment score. Furthermore, it demonstrates a commitment to using assessment tools responsibly, acknowledging their limitations and integrating them into a well-rounded selection strategy. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the Caliper assessment score without considering other factors fails to meet professional standards. This can lead to discriminatory hiring practices if the assessment has inherent biases, or if it does not accurately predict job performance for all individuals. Ethically, it is unsound to make significant hiring decisions based on a single, potentially flawed measure. Another incorrect approach might involve misinterpreting the assessment results or using them for purposes for which they were not designed. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of psychometric principles and can lead to poor hiring decisions and potential legal challenges related to unfair employment practices. A further incorrect approach could be to disregard the assessment entirely, even if it has been validated for the role, thereby missing out on potentially valuable insights that could improve hiring quality. This would be a failure to leverage available tools for effective talent acquisition. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the purpose and validity of any assessment tool, including the Caliper assessment, for the specific role. This involves consulting the assessment provider's guidelines and research. The next step is to integrate the assessment results with other relevant data points, such as interview performance, experience, and qualifications, to form a comprehensive candidate profile. Regular review of the assessment's effectiveness and its impact on diversity and inclusion within the hiring process is also crucial. This iterative process ensures that the assessment remains a valuable and ethical tool in talent acquisition. Question 2. Strategic planning requires a comprehensive understanding of team capabilities and potential areas for development. A manager has recently utilized a Caliper assessment for their team members as part of a broader talent review process. While reviewing the results, the manager notices that one employee's assessment indicates a lower score in a specific behavioral trait that the manager believes is crucial for an upcoming strategic initiative. The manager is under pressure to ensure the team successfully executes this initiative. What is the most appropriate course of action for the manager? Option A. Use the Caliper assessment results to identify employees who may not be a good fit for the new strategic direction and consider them for potential redundancy. Option B. Solely rely on the manager's subjective gut feeling about the employee's performance and potential. Disregarding the Caliper assessment results entirely, Option C. Initiate a formal performance improvement plan for the employee, citing the Caliper assessment results as a primary indicator of the need for development in the identified trait, while also gathering specific examples of observable behaviors that align with the assessment's findings. Option D. Integrate the Caliper assessment results as one data point among many, including observable behaviors, documented performance against goals, and feedback from colleagues, to form a holistic view of the employee's strengths and development needs relevant to the strategic initiative. Correct answer is C. Initiate a formal performance improvement plan for the employee, citing the Caliper assessment results as a primary indicator of the need for development in the identified trait, while also gathering specific examples of observable behaviors that align with the assessment's findings. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent subjectivity in interpreting and applying personality assessment results within a performance management context. The manager must balance the need for objective performance evaluation with the ethical considerations of using personality data, ensuring fairness and avoiding discriminatory practices. The pressure to meet departmental targets adds a layer of complexity, potentially tempting a shortcut that could compromise ethical standards. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing a holistic and objective evaluation of employee performance. It acknowledges the Caliper assessment as one data point among many, emphasizing observable behaviors, objective metrics, and documented performance against established goals. This aligns with ethical principles of fairness and non-discrimination, ensuring that employment decisions are based on merit and job-related criteria, not on potentially biased interpretations of personality traits. It also adheres to the spirit of responsible assessment use, where results are integrated thoughtfully and not used in isolation. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach fails by over-relying on the Caliper assessment results to justify a performance improvement plan. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it treats a personality assessment as a definitive diagnostic tool for performance deficiencies, which it is not designed to be. Such an approach risks misinterpreting personality traits as performance issues, leading to unfair and potentially discriminatory actions. It bypasses the need for concrete, observable evidence of underperformance and documented feedback, which are essential for a legitimate performance improvement process. Another incorrect approach errs by dismissing the Caliper assessment entirely and solely focusing on subjective gut feelings about employee performance. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it abandons any attempt at objective evaluation and relies on potentially biased personal impressions. While the Caliper assessment should not be the sole basis for decisions, completely ignoring it and relying on subjective judgment can lead to inconsistent and unfair treatment of employees, failing to establish clear, measurable performance standards. A third incorrect approach is flawed by using the Caliper assessment results to identify employees for potential redundancy based on perceived fit with future strategic goals. This represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Personality assessments are not designed to predict future strategic fit for redundancy purposes. Using them in this manner is highly susceptible to bias, lacks objective justification, and could lead to discriminatory practices, violating principles of fair employment, and potentially leading to legal challenges. It prioritizes a subjective interpretation of personality over demonstrable skills, experience, and objective performance data. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach performance management and assessment data with a structured, multifaceted decision-making process. This involves 1. Clearly defining performance expectations and objectives. 2. Gathering diverse data points, including objective metrics, observable behaviors, peer feedback, and documented performance reviews. 3. Integrating assessment results thoughtfully, understanding their limitations and using them as supplementary information rather than definitive conclusions. 4. Ensuring all decisions are based on job-related criteria and are applied consistently and fairly. 5. Documenting all performance discussions and decisions thoroughly. 6. Consulting with HR or legal counsel when making significant employment decisions, especially those involving performance improvement or potential termination. Question 3. Compliance review shows that a financial advisory firm is onboarding new clients. The firm's standard procedure involves sending clients a comprehensive questionnaire that requests a wide range of personal and financial details, including income, assets, liabilities, investment experience, risk tolerance, and even details about their dependents and marital status. While the firm states in its privacy policy that this information is used for suitability assessments, clients are not explicitly asked to consent to the collection of each specific data point before it is gathered, nor are they given a clear, concise summary of why each piece of information is critical for their financial advice. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional best practices for client data collection and suitability assessments? Option A. Pre-fill the questionnaire with as much client information as is readily available from other sources, requiring clients only to sign off on the completed form without detailed review or specific consent for each data point. Option B. Implement a process where clients are presented with a clear, concise explanation of why each category of information is needed for their suitability assessment, and are required to provide explicit consent for the collection and use of their data before the questionnaire is completed. Option C. Continue with the current practice of sending a comprehensive questionnaire, assuming that clients understand the necessity of providing all requested information for suitability purposes as outlined in the general privacy policy. Option D. Reduce the questionnaire to only the most basic financial figures, e.g., total assets and income, to minimize data collection, even if it means a less detailed suitability assessment. The correct answer is B. Implement a process where clients are presented with a clear, concise explanation of why each category of information is needed for their suitability assessment, and are required to provide explicit consent for the collection and use of their data before the questionnaire is completed. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a firm's need to gather client information for suitability assessments and the client's right to privacy and data protection. The firm must navigate these competing interests while adhering to regulatory requirements for client onboarding and ongoing suitability. The challenge lies in striking a balance that is both compliant and client-centric, ensuring that the information collected is necessary and proportionate, and that clients understand how their data will be used. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing a clear, transparent, and consent-based method for data collection. This aligns with principles of data privacy and client trust. Specifically, it reflects a commitment to obtaining explicit consent for the collection and use of personal information, ensuring that clients are fully informed about the purpose of the data gathering, i.e., suitability assessment, and how their data will be handled. This proactive communication fosters transparency and builds confidence, which are foundational to a strong client-advisor relationship and regulatory compliance. It also ensures that the firm is collecting only the information that is necessary for its stated purpose, thereby minimizing data collection and respecting client privacy. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves collecting all available client data without explicit consent, relying on the assumption that clients understand this is part of the onboarding process. This fails to meet regulatory requirements for informed consent and data protection. It can lead to breaches of privacy, erode client trust, and expose the firm to regulatory penalties for non-compliance with data handling regulations. Ethically, it is a violation of the client's right to control their personal information. Another incorrect approach is to collect only the bare minimum of information, potentially compromising the thoroughness of the suitability assessment. While this might seem to prioritize privacy, it can lead to inadequate client profiling, resulting in unsuitable investment recommendations. This failure to conduct a proper suitability assessment is a direct contravention of regulatory obligations designed to protect investors. It also represents a failure in professional duty to act in the client's best interest. A third incorrect approach is to use pre-filled forms with extensive personal details without providing clients an opportunity to review, correct, or consent to the specific data points being collected. This approach bypasses the crucial step of informed consent in client agency. It can lead to the collection of inaccurate or irrelevant data, and more importantly, it disregards the client's right to understand and control the information held about them, potentially leading to regulatory scrutiny and reputational damage. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific regulatory obligations regarding client data collection and suitability assessments. This should be followed by a client-centric approach that prioritizes transparency and informed consent. Before collecting any personal data, professionals must clearly articulate the purpose of the collection, how the data will be used, and who it will be shared with. They should then seek explicit consent from the client. Furthermore, professionals must ensure that the data collected is necessary and proportionate to the stated purpose, and that clients have the opportunity to review and correct their information. This process not only ensures regulatory compliance, but also builds a foundation of trust and ethical practice. Question 4. What factors determine the most effective interpretation and application of Caliper assessment results when making a hiring decision for a leadership position? Option A. The candidate's willingness to undergo further assessments, regardless of the relevance of the Caliper assessment findings to the position. Option B. The subjective impression of the hiring manager regarding the candidate's personality, without reference to the assessment results or job requirements. Option C. The alignment of the candidate's assessed behavioral traits with the specific competencies and demands of the leadership role, supported by corroborating evidence from interviews and past performance. Option D. The candidate's overall score on the Caliper assessment, irrespective of the specific traits measured or the nuances of the leadership role. The correct answer is C. The alignment of the candidate's assessed behavioral traits with the specific competencies and demands of the leadership role, supported by corroborating evidence from interviews and past performance. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in professional assessment, where an individual's performance on a standardized evaluation, like the Caliper assessment, needs to be interpreted within a broader context. The professional challenge lies in moving beyond a simple score to understand the underlying behavioral traits and their implications for a specific role, while adhering to ethical and regulatory guidelines regarding assessment use. This requires nuanced judgment, as a single assessment score is rarely a definitive predictor of success and can be influenced by various external and internal factors. The correct approach emphasizes a holistic interpretation of the Caliper assessment results, integrating them with other relevant information such as job requirements, interview feedback, and observable performance. This represents best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of fair and valid assessment. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing the use of psychological assessments in employment, mandate that evaluations be job-related and that decisions are based on a comprehensive understanding of the candidate, not solely on a single data point. Ethically, this approach promotes fairness and reduces the risk of biased decision-making. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the numerical score of the Caliper assessment, without considering the qualitative aspects or the specific demands of the role, fails to meet professional standards. This can lead to misinterpretations and potentially discriminatory outcomes, violating ethical principles of fairness and potentially regulatory requirements for job-related assessments. Another incorrect approach, which dismisses the assessment results entirely due to minor inconsistencies or perceived subjectivity, also represents a failure. Professional practice requires a reasoned evaluation of all assessment data, and discarding it without a valid justification can lead to overlooking critical behavioral insights that are relevant to job performance and team dynamics. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, understanding the purpose and limitations of the specific assessment tool being used, in this case, the Caliper assessment. Second, thoroughly analyzing the assessment results in conjunction with the defined requirements of the role. Third, gathering and integrating corroborating information from other sources, such as interviews and performance reviews. Finally, making a well-reasoned judgment that is supported by multiple data points and adheres to all relevant ethical and regulatory guidelines. Question 5. Compliance review shows that a client who recently experienced a significant loss on a particular type of investment is now requesting to invest a substantial portion of their portfolio into a new product that shares similar characteristics to the one that performed poorly. The client expresses a strong desire for this specific product, stating they feel it's the right time and that they need to make back what they lost. As the advisor, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Execute the investment as requested by the client, but make a note in the client file that the client insisted on this investment despite the advisor's reservations. Option B. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the underlying reasons for their request, reevaluate their current financial goals, risk tolerance, and overall suitability of the proposed investment, and then present a recommendation based on this comprehensive assessment. Option C. Immediately proceed with the client's requested investment, as their explicit instruction overrides any concerns about suitability or past performance. Option D. Firmly reject the client's request and insist on investing in a completely different asset class that the advisor believes is more appropriate, without further discussion. The correct answer is B. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the underlying reasons for their request, reevaluate their current financial goals, risk tolerance, and overall suitability of the proposed investment, and then present a recommendation based on this comprehensive assessment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a potential conflict between a client's stated preferences and the advisor's professional judgment regarding the suitability of an investment. The advisor must navigate the client's emotional response to a past loss while upholding their fiduciary duty to recommend investments that are appropriate for the client's risk tolerance, financial situation, and objectives. The pressure to satisfy the client's immediate desire for a specific, potentially unsuitable, product can be significant, requiring a strong ethical compass and robust communication skills. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, client-centric discussion that prioritizes understanding the client's underlying concerns and reevaluating their financial goals and risk tolerance in light of their recent experience. This aligns with the core principles of client advisory, emphasizing suitability and a fiduciary responsibility to act in the client's best interest. By seeking to understand the why behind the client's request for the specific product, the advisor can address the emotional drivers and guide the client towards a more appropriate solution that aligns with their long-term financial well-being, rather than simply fulfilling a potentially misguided request. This approach upholds regulatory expectations for due diligence and client suitability. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately agreeing to the client's request without further investigation. This fails to meet the advisor's duty of care and suitability obligations. It prioritizes client satisfaction over client well-being and ignores the potential for the investment to be inappropriate given the client's recent negative experience and potential emotional bias. This could lead to regulatory breaches related to suitability and a failure to act in the client's best interest. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright and rigidly insist on a different course of action, without attempting to understand the client's perspective or the reasons behind their preference. This can damage the client relationship and may overlook valid, albeit emotionally driven, concerns the client has. It demonstrates a lack of empathy and a failure to engage in a collaborative advisory process, potentially leading to client dissatisfaction and a perception of being unheard, which can have reputational and regulatory implications. A third incorrect approach is to proceed with the recommended investment without adequately documenting the rationale for deviating from the client's initial request, or without ensuring the client fully understands the risks and suitability considerations. This creates a compliance risk, as it may not be clear that the advisor has fulfilled their due diligence requirements, or that the client has provided informed consent to a recommendation that might differ from their initial stated preference. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with active listening and empathetic engagement with the client's concerns. This should be followed by a comprehensive reassessment of the client's financial profile, objectives, and risk tolerance, particularly in light of any significant life events or market experiences. The advisor must then clearly articulate their professional recommendation, explaining the rationale behind it and addressing any discrepancies with the client's initial requests. Transparency, thorough documentation, and a commitment to the client's best interests are paramount in navigating such situations. Question 6. Regulatory review indicates that the Caliper assessment process requires a robust approach to identifying and evaluating potential behavioral risks that could impact an individual's performance in a target role. Which of the following approaches to risk assessment within the Caliper assessment framework best aligns with the objective of providing actionable insights for selection and development? Option A. Comprehensive listing of all conceivable behavioral risks, regardless of their probability or significance to the specific role being assessed. Option B. A focus on identifying only those behavioral risks that are easily quantifiable, even if more significant qualitative risks are overlooked. Option C. A rapid identification of common behavioral risk categories without in-depth analysis of their specific relevance to the role or their potential impact. Option D. A systematic evaluation of identified behavioral risks, considering both their likelihood of occurrence and their potential impact on job performance, followed by the development of tailored mitigation strategies. The correct answer is D. A systematic evaluation of identified behavioral risks, considering both their likelihood of occurrence and their potential impact on job performance, followed by the development of tailored mitigation strategies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for thorough risk assessment with the practical constraints of time and resources, all while adhering to the specific requirements of the Caliper assessment framework. The assessor must demonstrate an understanding of how different risk assessment approaches align with the principles and objectives of the Caliper assessment, ensuring that the chosen method is both effective and compliant. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core purpose of the Caliper assessment, which is to evaluate an individual's potential for success in a specific role by identifying behavioral competencies and potential derailers. A comprehensive risk assessment that considers both the likelihood and impact of identified behavioral risks and then proposes proportionate mitigation strategies aligns with the proactive and predictive nature of the Caliper assessment. This approach ensures that the assessment's findings are not just descriptive, but also actionable, providing valuable insights for selection and development decisions. It demonstrates a commitment to a robust and responsible evaluation process, which is implicitly or explicitly supported by professional standards and ethical guidelines in assessment practices. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on identifying potential risks without assessing their impact or likelihood fails to provide a nuanced understanding of the actual threat posed by those risks. This can lead to an overemphasis on minor issues or a neglect of more significant concerns, rendering the assessment less effective. From a regulatory and ethical standpoint, this approach may violate principles of fairness and validity, as it does not provide a well-supported basis for decision-making. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over thoroughness by adopting a superficial risk assessment methodology risks overlooking critical behavioral indicators or potential derailers. This can result in inaccurate conclusions about an individual's suitability for a role, potentially leading to poor hiring decisions. Ethically, this approach breaches the duty of care owed to both the candidate and the employing organization, as it compromises the integrity and reliability of the assessment process. It may also contraindicate regulatory requirements for fair and valid assessment practices. A third incorrect approach that relies on generic risk categories without tailoring them to the specific role and context of the Caliper assessment misses the opportunity to provide relevant and actionable insights. The Caliper assessment is designed to be role-specific, and therefore, the risk assessment should reflect the unique demands and challenges of that role. Failing to do so can lead to an assessment that is not fit for purpose, potentially leading to misinterpretations of the candidate's profile and inappropriate recommendations. This can be seen as a failure to meet the professional standards of assessment practice, which emphasize relevance and specificity. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the assessment's objectives, the specific regulatory framework governing it, and the nature of the role being assessed. Professionals should first define the scope of the risk assessment, considering what types of behavioral risks are most relevant. They should then select a methodology that allows for a systematic evaluation of both the likelihood and impact of these risks. Finally, they must develop practical and proportionate mitigation strategies that are directly linked to the identified risks and the assessment's purpose, ensuring that the entire process is defensible, ethical, and aligned with best practices. Question 7. The efficiency study reveals a significant divergence in the application of client onboarding procedures across various departments, leading to inconsistent documentation quality and potential compliance gaps. Which of the following represents the most effective and professionally responsible course of action to address this issue? Option A. Delegate the task of creating a new onboarding manual to the most junior compliance officer, with minimal oversight to expedite the resolution. Option B. Immediately implement a new high-tech onboarding software across all departments to enforce uniformity, assuming it will resolve the documentation inconsistencies. Option C. Focus on identifying the departments with the highest error rates and implement punitive measures to incentivize immediate improvement in documentation quality. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of all current onboarding workflows. Identify the root causes of the discrepancies and develop a standardized, compliant procedure with input from relevant stakeholders, followed by targeted training. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive review of all current onboarding workflows, identify the root causes of the discrepancies, and develop a standardized, compliant procedure with input from relevant stakeholders, followed by targeted training. Explanation: the efficiency study reveals a significant discrepancy in how client onboarding documentation is handled across different teams. This scenario is professionally challenging because it highlights potential inconsistencies in regulatory compliance and client service quality, directly impacting the firm's reputation and adherence to regulatory standards. The need for a standardized, compliant, and efficient process is paramount. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, data-driven review of existing processes, identifies root causes of the discrepancies, and proposes a standardized solution that aligns with regulatory requirements for client due diligence and record keeping. This proactive and systematic method ensures that all client interactions meet the highest standards of compliance and operational excellence, thereby mitigating risks and enhancing client trust. It reflects a commitment to continuous improvement and adherence to the principles of sound business practice as expected under regulatory oversight. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost reduction without addressing the underlying process issues would be professionally unacceptable. This would likely lead to superficial fixes that fail to resolve the root causes of the documentation discrepancies, potentially resulting in ongoing compliance breaches and increased risk of regulatory sanctions. Such an approach ignores the fundamental responsibility to maintain robust internal controls and uphold client protection standards. Another incorrect approach that involves implementing a new system without adequate training or consultation with the affected teams is also professionally unacceptable. This disregards the practical realities of implementation and the importance of user buy-in, leading to potential system underutilization, errors, and resistance to change. It fails to acknowledge that effective process change requires a human element and a clear understanding of operational workflows, which are critical for regulatory adherence and client satisfaction. A further incorrect approach that delegates the entire problem-solving process to junior staff without senior oversight is professionally unacceptable. This not only places undue pressure on less experienced personnel, but also risks overlooking critical regulatory nuances or strategic implications. Effective problem-solving in a regulated environment requires experienced judgment and a clear understanding of the firm's compliance obligations and strategic objectives. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, clearly define the problem and its scope. Second, gather comprehensive data and analyze root causes. Third, identify and evaluate potential solutions, considering regulatory compliance, operational efficiency, and client impact. Fourth, develop a clear implementation plan with defined responsibilities and timelines. And finally, establish mechanisms for ongoing monitoring and evaluation to ensure sustained effectiveness and compliance. Question 8. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a new investment product offers significantly higher commission revenue for the firm. The Caliper assessment has been introduced as a tool to help advisors determine client suitability for such products. Which of the following represents the most appropriate professional approach when considering recommending this new product to a client? Option A. Proceed with recommending the new product to clients who exhibit a moderate to high score on the risk tolerance section of the Caliper assessment, as this generally indicates they can handle potentially higher return, high-risk investments. Option B. Utilize the Caliper assessment to gather data on the client's risk tolerance and financial personality, and then integrate these insights with a comprehensive review of the client's financial goals, existing portfolio, and capacity for loss to determine if the new product is genuinely suitable and in their best interest. Option C. Implement the Caliper assessment as a mandatory step for all clients, and if the client's profile generally aligns with the product's risk profile, proceed with the recommendation to capitalize on the firm's increased revenue opportunity. Option D. Focus on highlighting the potential for high returns and the attractive commission structure of the new product to clients, using the Caliper assessment primarily to confirm that the client is not overly risk-averse. The correct answer is B. Utilize the Caliper assessment to gather data on the client's risk tolerance and financial personality, and then integrate these insights with a comprehensive review of the client's financial goals, existing portfolio, and capacity for loss to determine if the new product is genuinely suitable and in their best interest. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate financial benefits of a new service with the potential long-term risks and the ethical obligation to ensure client suitability and understanding. The Caliper assessment, as a tool, is designed to provide insights into an individual's financial personality and risk tolerance. Its application must be guided by a commitment to client best interests, which supersedes the pursuit of revenue. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation and risk profile before recommending any product, even one that appears lucrative. This aligns with the fundamental principles of client-centric advice, ensuring that recommendations are suitable and not driven by the firm's or advisor's financial gain. It demonstrates adherence to regulatory expectations that demand a fiduciary duty or a similar standard of care, requiring advisors to act in the client's best interest. This involves a comprehensive assessment of the client's objectives, risk tolerance, and financial capacity, using tools like the Caliper assessment as a support to this process, not a replacement for it. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the perceived profitability of the new service, without adequately considering the client's suitability, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could lead to mis-selling, where products are recommended that are not appropriate for the client's circumstances, potentially resulting in financial harm. Such an approach violates principles of suitability and client protection, which are cornerstones of financial regulation. It prioritizes commercial interests over client welfare, a direct contravention of ethical codes and regulatory mandates designed to maintain market integrity and investor confidence. Another incorrect approach might involve superficial use of the Caliper assessment, treating it as a mere formality rather than a tool for deep client understanding. This failure to engage with the assessment's insights, or to use them to inform a broader suitability analysis, also constitutes a breach of professional duty. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's needs and objectives. This involves active listening, comprehensive data gathering, and the appropriate use of assessment tools. The insights gained from tools like the Caliper assessment should then be integrated into a holistic suitability assessment. Any recommendation must be justifiable based on this assessment and clearly communicated to the client, including any associated risks and benefits. The firm's commercial interest should be a secondary consideration, never overriding the primary duty to act in the client's best interest. Question 9. Stakeholder feedback indicates a mixed perception of a candidate's leadership potential following their participation in the Caliper assessment. Some stakeholders highlight strong strategic thinking and decision-making, while others express concerns about their communication style and ability to foster collaboration. Which approach best aligns with professional best practices for evaluating this candidate? Option A. Focus exclusively on the negative feedback concerning communication and collaboration, as these are often cited as common reasons for leadership failure, and consider them as overriding factors despite other positive indicators. Option B. Synthesize the qualitative feedback with the quantitative results of the Caliper assessment, seeking specific behavioral examples from stakeholders to understand the nuances of their perceptions and how they relate to the assessed competencies. Option C. Rely primarily on the aggregate scores from the Caliper assessment, assuming it provides a definitive and objective measure of leadership potential, and use the stakeholder feedback only as a secondary, less influential data point. Option D. Prioritize the positive feedback regarding strategic thinking and decision-making, as these are often considered core leadership attributes, and downplay the communication and collaboration concerns as potentially subjective or less critical. The correct answer is B. Synthesize the qualitative feedback with the quantitative results of the Caliper assessment, seeking specific behavioral examples from stakeholders to understand the nuances of their perceptions and how they relate to the assessed competencies. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for objective assessment with the potential for subjective bias, especially when dealing with qualitative feedback. Caliper assessment, as a tool, aims to provide insights into an individual's behavioral competencies. When stakeholder feedback is mixed, it necessitates a nuanced approach to interpretation, moving beyond simple aggregation to understand the underlying reasons for differing perceptions. Careful judgment is required to avoid overemphasizing positive or negative feedback without a thorough investigation of the context and specific examples provided. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive and objective evaluation. By seeking specific behavioral examples and cross-referencing them with the Caliper assessment results, a more robust and validated understanding of the individual's competencies is achieved. This method aligns with ethical principles of fairness and accuracy in assessment, ensuring that decisions are based on a holistic view rather than isolated opinions or potentially biased interpretations. It also allows for constructive feedback and development planning by identifying specific areas for improvement or reinforcement. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the aggregate of stakeholder opinions, without seeking specific examples or considering the Caliper results, fails to provide a deep understanding. This can lead to superficial conclusions and potentially unfair judgments, violating the ethical duty to conduct thorough and objective assessments. Another incorrect approach that dismisses negative feedback due to the individual's overall positive performance ignores critical developmental opportunities and can create a blind spot regarding potential behavioral issues that might impact long-term effectiveness or team dynamics. This approach is ethically questionable as it may overlook behaviors that, while not immediately detrimental, could escalate or negatively affect others. An approach that solely focuses on the Caliper assessment results without considering real-world stakeholder observations risks creating a disconnect between theoretical potential and practical application, leading to decisions that are not grounded in observable performance. This can be seen as a failure to conduct a complete and relevant assessment. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that involves 1. Acknowledging and analyzing all feedback, both quantitative and qualitative. 2. Seeking specific, observable behavioral examples to support or contextualize feedback. 3. Integrating stakeholder feedback with objective assessment data, such as the Caliper assessment. 4. Identifying discrepancies and investigating their root causes. 5. Forming conclusions based on a synthesis of all available evidence, prioritizing fairness, accuracy, and developmental impact. Question 10. To address the challenge of integrating the Caliper assessment into the firm's hiring process while ensuring fairness and compliance, which implementation strategy best balances these critical considerations? Option A. Conduct a pilot program with a diverse subset of candidates, rigorously validating the assessment's predictive validity and fairness for specific roles, and establish clear data privacy protocols before wider rollout. Option B. Integrate the Caliper assessment as a supplementary tool, giving significant weight to its results alongside subjective interviewer impressions without formal validation. Option C. Utilize the Caliper assessment only for senior-level positions where the stakes are higher, assuming its complexity makes it inherently fair for all candidates. Option D. Implement the Caliper assessment broadly across all new hires immediately, relying on the vendor's assurance of its validity and fairness. The correct answer is D. Implement the Caliper assessment broadly across all new hires immediately, relying on the vendor's assurance of its validity and fairness. Explanation. The scenario presents a common implementation challenge where a new assessment tool, the Caliper assessment, is being introduced into a firm's hiring process. The challenge lies in ensuring that the implementation aligns with the firm's existing ethical commitments and regulatory obligations, particularly concerning fair hiring practices and data privacy. The firm must balance the potential benefits of the Caliper assessment in identifying suitable candidates with the imperative to avoid discriminatory outcomes and protect candidate information. Careful judgment is required to select an implementation strategy that is both effective and compliant. The correct approach emphasizes a phased rollout with robust validation and ongoing monitoring. This represents best professional practice because it allows the firm to systematically assess the Caliper assessment's predictive validity and fairness across different demographic groups before full-scale adoption. This proactive approach aligns with regulatory expectations for employers to use selection tools that are job-related and do not result in adverse impact. It also demonstrates a commitment to ethical data handling by ensuring that data collected is used appropriately and securely. Continuous monitoring is crucial for identifying and mitigating any unintended biases that may emerge over time, thereby upholding principles of equal opportunity and non-discrimination. An incorrect approach that involves immediate, widespread adoption without prior validation poses significant regulatory and ethical risks. This could lead to unintentional discrimination if the assessment tool is found to be biased against certain protected groups, violating equal employment opportunity laws. Another incorrect approach, focusing solely on the assessment's perceived efficiency without considering its impact on candidate experience or data privacy, could lead to ethical breaches and potential violations of data protection regulations. Failing to provide adequate training to hiring managers on the proper interpretation and application of the Caliper assessment results is also a critical failure, as it increases the likelihood of subjective or biased decision-making, undermining the assessment's intended objectivity and potentially leading to discriminatory hiring practices. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes a thorough understanding of the assessment tool's psychometric properties, its potential for adverse impact, and relevant legal and ethical considerations. This involves conducting pilot studies, seeking expert advice on validation, and establishing clear protocols for data management and usage. A commitment to transparency with candidates about the assessment's purpose and how their data will be used is also essential. Question 11. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of minor, infrequent deviations from expected behavioral metrics for a specific group of employees involved in client advisory roles. These deviations, while not individually significant enough to trigger an immediate formal reassessment under the current policy, are occurring across a broader segment of this employee group than previously observed. What is the most appropriate professional response to this situation, considering the ongoing requirements of the Caliper assessment framework? Option A. Disregard the deviations as they are minor and infrequent, focusing resources on more significant compliance issues identified elsewhere in the firm. Option B. Immediately trigger a full, formal Caliper reassessment for all employees exhibiting these minor deviations to ensure comprehensive compliance. Option C. Initiate a targeted review of the monitoring system's parameters and the underlying causes of these deviations, potentially leading to a revised internal guidance or training program for the affected employees, rather than a full reassessment. Option D. Continue to monitor the situation without intervention, as the individual deviations do not meet the threshold for a formal reassessment as per current policy. The correct answer is C. Initiate a targeted review of the monitoring system's parameters and the underlying causes of these deviations, potentially leading to a revised internal guidance or training program for the affected employees, rather than a full reassessment. Explanation: the monitoring system demonstrates a potential gap in the firm's adherence to the Caliper assessment framework, specifically concerning the ongoing evaluation of employee suitability for regulated activities. The challenge lies in balancing the need for robust, continuous oversight with the practicalities of resource allocation and the potential for creating an overly burdensome or intrusive assessment process. A key aspect of the Caliper assessment framework, as interpreted within the regulatory context of the Caliper assessment, is the proactive identification and mitigation of risks associated with individual conduct and competence. This requires more than a one-time assessment. It necessitates a dynamic approach that adapts to changing circumstances and performance. The correct approach involves a systematic review of the monitoring system's output against the established criteria for ongoing suitability. This means not just identifying deviations, but also analyzing the nature, frequency, and severity of these deviations to determine if they trigger a formal reassessment or require targeted intervention. This aligns with the regulatory expectation of a firm, maintaining a culture of compliance and proactively managing conduct risk. It ensures that the firm is not merely ticking a box, but actively engaging with the information generated by its monitoring systems to uphold the integrity of its regulated activities and protect its clients. This proactive and analytical approach is the cornerstone of effective regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss minor or infrequent deviations without further investigation. This fails to acknowledge that even seemingly small issues can be indicators of a larger problem or a developing trend that could eventually lead to significant regulatory breaches or client harm. Such an approach risks a reactive stance, where issues are only addressed once they have escalated to a critical point, potentially resulting in disciplinary action, reputational damage, and financial penalties. This demonstrates a failure to implement the spirit of the Caliper assessment framework, which emphasizes continuous vigilance and early intervention. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately trigger a full, formal reassessment for every minor deviation. While thoroughness is important, this approach can be inefficient, costly, and may lead to employee demoralization if individuals are subjected to extensive reevaluation for trivial matters. It also fails to apply professional judgment in assessing the materiality of the deviation. The regulatory framework expects a proportionate response based on a reasoned assessment of the risk posed by the observed behavior. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the automated alerts from the monitoring system without any human oversight or qualitative analysis. Automated systems are tools, not replacements for professional judgment. They can flag anomalies, but it is the responsibility of trained personnel to interpret these alerts in context, understand the underlying reasons for the deviation, and determine the appropriate course of action. Over-reliance on automation without human oversight can lead to misinterpretations and missed opportunities for early intervention or appropriate support. The professional decision-making process in such situations involves a structured approach. First, understanding the specific requirements of the Caliper assessment framework and the firm's internal policies. Second, analyzing the data generated by the monitoring system to identify deviations. Third, assessing the nature, frequency, and potential impact of these deviations. Fourth, applying professional judgment to determine if the deviation warrants further investigation, targeted intervention, or a formal reassessment. And finally, documenting the decision-making process and the actions taken. This ensures accountability, transparency, and a consistent application of the firm's compliance obligations. Question 12. Benchmark analysis indicates that the firm's current client onboarding process may not fully capture the nuanced risk profiles required by the new Caliper assessment framework. Which of the following implementation strategies best balances regulatory compliance with operational efficiency and client experience? Option A. Immediately mandate the use of the Caliper assessment for all new clients. Relying on automated system prompts to guide advisors through the process without additional training or pilot testing. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive training program for all client-facing staff on the Caliper assessment methodology and interpretation, followed by a pilot rollout in a select branch to identify and address any operational or client feedback issues before a full firm-wide implementation. Option C. Delay the full implementation of the Caliper assessment until a new, fully integrated IT system is developed that can automate every aspect of the assessment and reporting. Option D. Implement the Caliper assessment solely through an online portal, requiring clients to complete it independently with no direct advisor interaction or qualitative review. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive training program for all client-facing staff on the Caliper assessment methodology and interpretation, followed by a pilot rollout in a select branch to identify and address any operational or client feedback issues before a full firm-wide implementation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge where a new regulatory requirement, the Caliper assessment, necessitates a shift in how client suitability is determined. The challenge lies in integrating this new, potentially more rigorous, assessment into existing client onboarding processes without disrupting business operations or alienating clients. The firm must balance compliance with the spirit and letter of the regulation against practical considerations like efficiency and client experience. The need for a standardized yet adaptable approach is paramount, as a one-size-fits-all solution might not adequately capture the nuances of individual client circumstances or the diverse range of investment products offered. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased implementation that includes comprehensive training for all relevant personnel, clear communication of the new procedures, and pilot testing of the Caliper assessment in a controlled environment before full rollout. This strategy ensures that staff understand the rationale behind the assessment, how to administer it accurately, and how to interpret the results in conjunction with other suitability factors. Pilot testing allows for identification and resolution of any practical issues, such as system integration problems or client feedback concerns, before they impact the entire client base. This methodical approach aligns with the regulatory intent of enhancing client protection by ensuring a robust and consistently applied suitability framework. It demonstrates a commitment to due diligence and proactive risk management, which are core tenets of regulatory compliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing the Caliper assessment without adequate staff training creates a significant risk of inconsistent application and misinterpretation of results. This failure to equip employees with the necessary knowledge and skills directly contravenes the regulatory expectation of competent advice and diligent client assessment. It could lead to unsuitable recommendations, exposing both the client and the firm to financial and reputational damage, and potentially violating regulations requiring advisors to act in the best interests of their clients. Rolling out the Caliper assessment without any form of pilot testing or feedback mechanism is a reactive rather than proactive approach. It risks encountering unforeseen operational or client-facing issues that could compromise the integrity of the assessment process or lead to client dissatisfaction. This lack of foresight can result in a rushed and potentially flawed implementation, undermining the intended benefits of the new assessment and failing to meet the regulatory standard for careful and considered operational changes. Adopting a purely automated approach to the Caliper assessment without allowing for professional judgment or consideration of qualitative factors risks oversimplifying client suitability. While automation can enhance efficiency, regulations typically require a holistic view of a client's circumstances, including their risk tolerance, financial situation, and investment objectives, which may not be fully captured by quantitative data alone. Relying solely on automated outputs without human oversight could lead to a failure to identify critical nuances, potentially resulting in unsuitable recommendations and a breach of fiduciary duties. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such an implementation challenge should adopt a structured, risk-based approach. This involves understanding the specific regulatory requirements, assessing the potential impact on existing processes and client relationships, and developing a phased implementation plan. Key steps include thorough research into best practices for similar regulatory changes, engaging with stakeholders, including compliance, operations, and frontline staff, and prioritizing training and communication. A continuous improvement mindset, incorporating feedback loops and post-implementation reviews, is crucial for ensuring ongoing compliance and operational effectiveness. The decision-making process should always prioritize client protection and regulatory adherence while seeking efficient and practical solutions. Question 13. Process analysis reveals that a long-standing client, who is generally cooperative, has requested a minor administrative adjustment to their account that, upon initial review, appears to slightly deviate from a strict interpretation of the firm's internal policy on client data handling. The client frames this as a simple convenience and expresses mild impatience when the request is not immediately fulfilled. The professional is aware that the firm's policy is in place to ensure robust data protection and compliance with regulatory standards. What is the most appropriate course of action for the professional in this situation? Option A. Inform the client that the request cannot be accommodated due to strict adherence to policy, without exploring potential compliant alternatives or seeking internal clarification. Option B. Proceed with the client's request, assuming the deviation is minor enough not to warrant formal escalation, given the client's history and the perceived administrative nature of the change. Option C. Immediately consult the firm's compliance department to seek clarification and guidance on how to proceed, ensuring adherence to both internal policy and regulatory requirements. Option D. Attempt to interpret the policy in a flexible manner that accommodates the client's request, believing that a strict interpretation would be overly burdensome for a valued client. The correct answer is C. Immediately consult the firm's compliance department to seek clarification and guidance on how to proceed, ensuring adherence to both internal policy and regulatory requirements. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's internal policies, which are designed to ensure compliance and ethical conduct, and the potential for a client to perceive a request as a minor administrative matter. The pressure to maintain client relationships can create a temptation to overlook or downplay potential policy breaches. Careful judgment is required to balance client service with the non-negotiable obligation to adhere to regulatory frameworks and internal ethical guidelines. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the firm's established compliance procedures and the underlying regulatory principles. By seeking guidance from the compliance department, the professional demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory integrity. This action ensures that any potential conflicts or ambiguities are addressed by those with the expertise to interpret and apply the relevant rules, thereby safeguarding both the client and the firm from regulatory violations and reputational damage. This aligns with the fundamental ethical duty of competence and due diligence. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the client's request without consulting compliance fails to uphold the firm's internal policies and potentially violates regulatory requirements. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for established control mechanisms designed to prevent misconduct. It can lead to situations where the firm inadvertently facilitates non-compliant activities, exposing it to significant penalties and reputational harm. Another incorrect approach, which involves attempting to interpret the policy in a way that favors the client's request without proper authorization, is a form of self-serving rationalization. This bypasses the established governance structure and introduces personal bias into decision-making, increasing the risk of misinterpreting or circumventing regulations. It erodes the integrity of the compliance framework and can be seen as a deliberate attempt to avoid scrutiny. Finally, an incorrect approach that involves delaying the response to the client while internally debating the policy's application without engaging the compliance department is inefficient and potentially damaging. While it avoids immediate noncompliance, it fails to proactively address the issue and can lead to client dissatisfaction or the perception that the firm is uncooperative. It also misses the opportunity to leverage the expertise of the compliance team to find a compliant solution. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential ethical or regulatory conflicts. This involves understanding the firm's policies and the relevant regulatory landscape. When faced with ambiguity or a request that seems to push boundaries, the immediate next step should be to consult the designated compliance or legal department. This ensures that decisions are made with full awareness of the implications and in accordance with established procedures and regulatory requirements. Documenting all interactions and decisions is also crucial for accountability and future reference. Question 14. Compliance review shows a pattern of minor but consistent deviations from established trading protocols by a high-revenue-generating client. The client's relationship manager has informally indicated that these deviations are for the client's convenience and pose no significant risk. The compliance officer is aware of these deviations and the relationship manager's assessment. What is the most appropriate course of action for the compliance officer? Option A. Advise the relationship manager to informally discuss the deviations with the client and request they cease without formal reporting. Option B. Accept the relationship manager's informal assurance that the deviations are minor and pose no risk, and take no further action. Option C. Initiate a formal, documented investigation into the deviations, assessing their potential impact and reporting findings according to internal policy and regulatory requirements. Option D. Immediately confront the client about the deviations and demand they cease all non-compliant activity. The correct answer is C. Initiate a formal, documented investigation into the deviations, assessing their potential impact and reporting findings according to internal policy and regulatory requirements. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's desire to maintain client relationships and the ethical obligation to report potential misconduct. The compliance officer must navigate the pressure to overlook minor infractions to preserve business interests while upholding regulatory integrity and client protection. The difficulty lies in balancing these competing demands and making a judgment call that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory adherence over short-term financial gains. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective investigation of the reported concerns, documented meticulously. This aligns with the fundamental principles of regulatory compliance, which mandate proactive identification and remediation of potential issues. By initiating a formal review, the compliance officer demonstrates adherence to internal policies and external regulations that require reporting and investigation of suspicious activities. This approach safeguards the firm from future penalties, protects clients from potential harm, and upholds the integrity of the financial markets. It reflects best professional practice by prioritizing transparency, accountability, and adherence to the spirit and letter of the law. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves dismissing the concerns without a proper investigation, based on the perceived low risk or the client's importance. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for due diligence and risk assessment. It creates a blind spot for potential systemic issues and exposes the firm to significant reputational and financial damage if the misconduct is later discovered. Ethically, it represents a dereliction of duty to protect clients and the market. Another incorrect approach is to conduct a superficial, informal inquiry that lacks proper documentation. While it may appear to address the issue, it fails to establish a clear audit trail or provide evidence of a robust compliance process. This approach is vulnerable to scrutiny by regulators and can be interpreted as an attempt to circumvent formal reporting obligations. It undermines the credibility of the compliance function and leaves the firm exposed. A third incorrect approach is to confront the client directly and demand immediate rectification without involving the appropriate internal compliance procedures. This bypasses established protocols, potentially jeopardizes the investigation by alerting the subject prematurely, and could lead to the destruction of evidence. It also fails to involve the necessary internal stakeholders who are responsible for assessing and managing regulatory risk. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such dilemmas should employ a structured decision-making process. First, they must clearly identify the ethical and regulatory obligations at play. Second, they should gather all relevant facts objectively, without preconceived notions. Third, they should consult internal policies and procedures, as well as relevant regulatory guidance, to understand the required course of action. Fourth, they should consider the potential consequences of each possible action, both for the firm and for clients. Finally, they should choose the course of action that best upholds ethical principles, regulatory requirements, and the firm's long-term integrity, even if it presents short-term challenges. Documentation of the entire process is paramount. Question 15. Governance review demonstrates that the current process for escalating complex client complaints to senior management is inconsistently applied, leading to potential delays in resolution and client dissatisfaction. Which of the following approaches best addresses this identified process deficiency within the context of the Caliper assessment's focus on operational integrity and client protection? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive review of the existing complaint escalation procedure. Benchmark it against relevant regulatory guidelines and industry best practices for client complaint handling, and propose targeted improvements to ensure timely and effective resolution. Option B. Assign a junior compliance officer to draft a revised escalation policy based on their interpretation of general best practices, without further consultation or review by senior leadership. Option C. Implement a new, simplified escalation matrix that limits the types of complaints eligible for senior management review to reduce the overall volume of escalations. Option D. Immediately introduce a mandatory one-time training session for all client-facing staff on the existing escalation protocol, without first assessing its effectiveness or potential for improvement. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive review of the existing complaint escalation procedure, benchmark it against relevant regulatory guidelines and industry best practices for client complaint handling, and propose targeted improvements to ensure timely and effective resolution. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the governance review has identified a potential gap in the process for handling client complaints, specifically regarding the timely escalation of complex issues. This requires careful judgment to balance efficiency with regulatory compliance and client satisfaction. The firm must ensure its processes not only meet, but exceed the minimum standards set by the regulatory framework to maintain trust and avoid potential sanctions. The correct approach, which involves a detailed review of the existing complaint handling procedure against regulatory requirements and industry best practices, represents best professional practice. This proactive and thorough examination ensures that the firm's processes are robust, compliant with the Caliper assessment's implied standards for client service and operational integrity, and designed to effectively address client concerns. It demonstrates a commitment to continuous improvement and adherence to the spirit of regulatory oversight, which prioritizes fair treatment of clients and the integrity of financial services. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on reducing the number of escalated complaints without a corresponding improvement in resolution quality or client satisfaction would be professionally unacceptable. This would likely violate ethical principles of client care and potentially regulatory guidelines that mandate effective complaint resolution, not just reduction. Another incorrect approach, which involves implementing a new, untested escalation protocol without proper training or integration into existing workflows, risks creating further confusion and delays, thereby failing to meet regulatory expectations for a well-defined and functional complaint handling system. A third incorrect approach, which involves delegating the review to a junior staff member without adequate oversight or expertise, could lead to superficial analysis and missed critical compliance issues, undermining the governance review's purpose and potentially exposing the firm to regulatory scrutiny. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the specific regulatory expectations related to client complaint handling and operational processes. They should then critically assess the current state against these expectations, identifying specific areas for improvement. This involves gathering data, consulting relevant policies, and considering the impact on clients and the firm's reputation. A structured approach, involving cross-functional collaboration and a focus on measurable outcomes, is crucial for developing and implementing effective process optimizations that align with both regulatory requirements and business objectives. Question 16. The performance metrics show a consistent pattern of low engagement with the firm's conflict of interest detection software, despite its comprehensive capabilities. Which of the following strategies best addresses this issue while upholding regulatory obligations? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of the current conflict of interest identification processes, user training programs, and software integration to identify and rectify any workflow inefficiencies or knowledge gaps. Option B. Implement a mandatory daily reporting requirement for all employees, irrespective of their role, to increase interaction with the conflict of interest software. Option C. Reduce the scope and functionality of the conflict of interest software to align with current usage levels, deeming the full capabilities unnecessary. Option D. Issue a firm-wide directive emphasizing the importance of the software and warning of disciplinary action for continued low engagement, without further investigation into the reasons. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough review of the current conflict of interest identification processes, user training programs, and software integration to identify and rectify any workflow inefficiencies or knowledge gaps. Explanation. The performance metrics show a consistent underutilization of a key compliance software module designed to flag potential conflicts of interest. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing operational efficiency with robust regulatory adherence. The firm has invested in this technology, implying a commitment to compliance, yet its potential is not being fully realized. The challenge lies in identifying the root cause of this underutilization and implementing a solution that enhances compliance without creating undue operational burden or introducing new risks. The correct approach involves a systematic review of the current workflow and user training related to the conflict of interest module. This includes assessing whether the software is adequately integrated into daily processes, if users understand its full capabilities and reporting requirements, and if there are any technical or procedural barriers to its effective use. By focusing on process optimization, the firm can ensure that the technology is leveraged to its full potential, thereby strengthening its compliance framework and mitigating regulatory risk. This aligns with the ethical duty to maintain adequate systems and controls and the regulatory expectation that firms actively manage and monitor for conflicts of interest. An incorrect approach would be to simply mandate increased usage without understanding the underlying issues. This could lead to superficial compliance, where users are forced to interact with the system in ways that are not meaningful or effective, potentially generating false positives or negatives. It also fails to address any systemic problems, such as inadequate training or workflow integration, which are likely the true reasons for underutilization. This approach risks creating a culture of box-ticking rather than genuine compliance, which could be viewed as a failure to implement adequate controls. Another incorrect approach would be to disable or deprioritize the module due to perceived inefficiency. This is a direct contravention of the regulatory expectation to proactively identify and manage conflicts of interest. Such an action would represent a significant ethical lapse and a clear violation of regulatory requirements, as it would deliberately reduce the firm's ability to detect and prevent potential misconduct. This demonstrates a disregard for compliance obligations and exposes the firm to substantial legal and reputational risk. The professional decision-making process in such a situation should begin with data analysis to understand the scope of the problem. This should be followed by a qualitative assessment involving relevant stakeholders, such as compliance officers and frontline staff, to identify the root causes of underutilization. Based on this understanding, a targeted intervention such as enhanced training, workflow adjustments, or system configuration changes should be developed and implemented. Finally, ongoing monitoring and evaluation are crucial to ensure the effectiveness of the implemented solution and to adapt to any evolving circumstances. Question 17. The audit findings indicate a consistent pattern of delays in the adoption and integration of new compliance protocols, leading to potential gaps in regulatory adherence. Considering the need for process optimization, which of the following approaches best addresses this issue while upholding professional standards? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive end-to-end review of the compliance protocol implementation lifecycle, from initial identification of a requirement to full operational integration, to pinpoint specific bottlenecks and areas for improvement, involving key stakeholders in the diagnostic and solution design phases. Option B. Temporarily suspend standard change control procedures for compliance-related updates to expedite their deployment, prioritizing speed over formal review. Option C. Implement a new, faster approval system for the final stages of compliance protocol rollout, assuming the primary cause of delay is administrative backlog at the end of the process. Option D. Outsource the entire redesign and implementation of compliance processes to a third-party vendor, with minimal internal oversight to reduce the firm's immediate resource burden. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive end-to-end review of the compliance protocol implementation lifecycle, from initial identification of a requirement to full operational integration, to pinpoint specific bottlenecks and areas for improvement, involving key stakeholders in the diagnostic and solution design phases. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a recurring pattern of delays in the implementation of new compliance procedures, directly impacting the firm's ability to adhere to evolving regulatory requirements. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for efficiency and process optimization with the paramount importance of regulatory compliance and risk mitigation. The firm must identify the root causes of these delays without compromising the integrity or effectiveness of the compliance framework. The correct approach, focusing on a systematic review of the entire process from identification of a compliance gap to the full integration of a new procedure, represents best professional practice. This involves mapping the current workflow, identifying bottlenecks, and engaging relevant stakeholders to understand the practical challenges. It aligns with the ethical duty to act with due care and diligence, ensuring that processes are robust and support the firm's commitment to compliance. This proactive and thorough method minimizes the risk of overlooking critical control points or implementing superficial fixes that do not address underlying issues, thereby upholding the firm's reputation and avoiding potential regulatory sanctions. An incorrect approach that solely focuses on accelerating the final approval stage without examining the preceding steps is professionally unacceptable. This would likely lead to rushed decisions, inadequate risk assessments, and a higher probability of errors in the implemented procedures. This failure to conduct a comprehensive review could be seen as a breach of the duty of care, potentially violating regulatory expectations for robust internal controls and risk management. Another incorrect approach, which involves bypassing established change management protocols to expedite implementation, is also professionally unacceptable. While seemingly efficient in the short term, this bypasses essential checks and balances, increasing the risk of introducing unintended consequences or security vulnerabilities. This disregard for established procedures demonstrates a lack of professional judgment and could lead to significant compliance breaches, violating the principle of acting with integrity and in the best interests of the firm and its clients. A further incorrect approach, relying solely on external consultants to redesign the process without internal buy-in or understanding, is professionally unsound. This approach fails to leverage internal expertise and may result in solutions that are impractical or unsustainable for the firm's operational context. It neglects the importance of internal ownership and knowledge transfer, which are crucial for long-term process effectiveness and compliance. This could be interpreted as a failure to exercise due diligence in ensuring the implemented solutions are fit for purpose and sustainable. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, clearly define the problem and its impact. Second, gather comprehensive data and feedback from all relevant parties. Third, analyze the root causes using a systematic methodology. Fourth, develop and evaluate potential solutions, considering their impact on compliance, efficiency, and operational feasibility. Fifth, implement the chosen solution with appropriate controls and monitoring. And finally, regularly review and refine the process to ensure ongoing effectiveness and adherence to regulatory standards. Question 18. Stakeholder feedback indicates that some participants find certain questions within the Caliper assessment to be ambiguous and question their direct relevance to the job roles for which they are being assessed. This feedback has led to concerns about the assessment's perceived fairness and utility among hiring managers. Option A. Disregard the feedback, asserting that the Caliper assessment is a scientifically validated tool and that stakeholder perceptions are not a basis for altering its structure. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the assessment items by qualified psychometricians, comparing the feedback against the established validity evidence for the Caliper assessment and its intended use, and then implement changes based on expert recommendations and empirical data. Option C. Conduct a series of focus groups with stakeholders to gather more anecdotal evidence, and then make ad hoc adjustments to the assessment based on the majority sentiment expressed in these groups. Option D. Immediately revise the wording of all questions flagged by stakeholders to address their perceived ambiguity and perceived lack of relevance, without further psychometric validation. The correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the assessment items by qualified psychometricians, comparing the feedback against the established validity evidence for the Caliper assessment and its intended use, and then implement changes based on expert recommendations and empirical data. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate needs and perceptions of stakeholders with the long-term integrity and effectiveness of the Caliper assessment process. Stakeholders, while valuable sources of feedback, may not fully understand the psychometric principles or the intended application of the assessment. Their feedback, if acted upon without critical evaluation, could inadvertently compromise the validity and fairness of the assessment. Careful judgment is required to discern actionable insights from subjective opinions or misunderstandings. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, data-driven, and expert-informed review of the feedback. This aligns with the ethical obligation to ensure assessments are valid, reliable, and used appropriately. By engaging psychometric experts and conducting a thorough analysis of the feedback against established assessment principles and the specific goals of the Caliper assessment, the organization upholds its commitment to fairness and scientific rigor. This approach also demonstrates transparency and a willingness to improve while maintaining the foundational integrity of the assessment tool. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate stakeholder appeasement without expert validation risks undermining the assessment's credibility. This could lead to the implementation of changes based on anecdotal evidence rather than psychometric soundness, potentially introducing bias or reducing predictive validity. Such an approach fails to meet the ethical standard of ensuring assessment quality and could violate principles of responsible assessment practice by making arbitrary modifications. Another incorrect approach that dismisses stakeholder feedback entirely, without any attempt to understand or analyze it, is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of responsiveness and can erode trust with stakeholders, who are essential partners in the assessment's successful implementation. While not directly compromising the assessment's psychometric properties, it fails to address potential operational or perceptual issues that, while not strictly psychometric, can impact the assessment's overall effectiveness and acceptance. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Acknowledge and document all stakeholder feedback. 2. Categorize feedback based on its nature, e.g., clarity of questions, perceived relevance, administrative issues, perceived fairness. 3. Consult with internal or external psychometric experts to evaluate feedback against assessment principles and the specific psychometric properties of the Caliper assessment. 4. Analyze feedback for patterns and themes that may indicate systemic issues or areas for improvement. 5. Prioritize potential changes based on their impact on validity, reliability, fairness, and practical utility. 6. Communicate the findings of the review and any proposed actions to stakeholders, explaining the rationale behind decisions. Question 19. Quality control measures reveal inconsistencies between a client's stated investment preferences and their financial capacity, as indicated in preliminary documentation for a Caliper assessment. The advisor has a tight deadline to complete the assessment for a scheduled meeting. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Rely solely on the client's stated preferences, as these are the most direct indicators of their desires, and defer further financial capacity analysis to a later stage. Option B. Make reasonable assumptions about the client's risk tolerance and financial situation to bridge the gaps in the documentation, allowing the assessment to be completed on time. Option C. Proceed with the assessment based on the initial documentation, assuming the client's stated preferences are accurate and the financial capacity data may be less critical for this stage. Option D. Initiate a follow-up conversation with the client to clarify the discrepancies and gather further information before finalizing the assessment. The correct answer is D. Initiate a follow-up conversation with the client to clarify the discrepancies and gather further information before finalizing the assessment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where a financial advisor, Sarah, is tasked with evaluating a client's investment suitability based on information that appears incomplete or potentially misleading. The core difficulty lies in balancing the client's stated preferences with objective risk assessment and regulatory compliance. Sarah must exercise sound judgment to ensure she is acting in the client's best interest and adhering to the Caliper assessment framework, which emphasizes a thorough understanding of client risk tolerance and financial capacity. The pressure to proceed quickly, coupled with the ambiguity of the client's responses, necessitates a structured decision-making process to avoid regulatory breaches and ethical lapses. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves Sarah proactively seeking clarification and additional information from the client to resolve the discrepancies identified during the quality control review. This aligns with the fundamental principles of client due diligence and suitability requirements mandated by regulatory frameworks governing financial advice. Specifically, it upholds the ethical obligation to act in the client's best interest and the regulatory imperative to ensure that investment recommendations are appropriate for the client's circumstances, risk tolerance, and financial objectives. By engaging in further dialogue, Sarah demonstrates a commitment to a robust decision-making framework that prioritizes accuracy and client understanding over expediency. This proactive stance ensures that the Caliper assessment is conducted with integrity, leading to a more reliable basis for investment advice. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with the assessment without addressing the identified discrepancies represents a failure to conduct adequate due diligence. This approach risks making recommendations based on flawed assumptions, which could lead to unsuitable investments for the client. Ethically, it breaches the duty of care and the obligation to act in the client's best interest. From a regulatory standpoint, it could be construed as a violation of suitability rules, as the assessment would not be based on a complete and accurate understanding of the client's profile. Accepting the client's initial responses at face value, despite the quality control flags, ignores the potential for misinterpretation or a lack of full comprehension on the client's part. This approach bypasses the critical step of verifying information and assessing the client's true risk capacity. It is ethically questionable as it prioritizes superficial compliance over genuine client welfare and can lead to regulatory scrutiny for failing to perform a thorough assessment. Making assumptions about the client's intentions or risk tolerance to fill the gaps is a significant ethical and regulatory misstep. Assumptions, especially regarding risk, can be highly subjective and may not reflect the client's actual comfort level with potential losses. This can result in recommendations that are either too conservative or too aggressive, both of which are detrimental to the client and violate the principles of suitability and fiduciary duty. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with acknowledging any identified anomalies or inconsistencies. The next step is to gather all relevant information, which may involve direct communication with the client to clarify ambiguities and confirm understanding. This information should then be critically evaluated against established assessment criteria and regulatory guidelines. If significant uncertainties remain, the professional should escalate the issue or seek further guidance rather than proceeding with a potentially compromised assessment. This iterative process of information gathering, verification, and critical evaluation ensures that decisions are well-founded, ethically sound, and compliant with all applicable regulations. Question 20. The monitoring system demonstrates that an employee's recent Caliper assessment results indicate potential challenges in areas related to interpersonal communication and adaptability. The employee has otherwise met performance expectations in their current role, with no formal disciplinary actions or documented performance issues. What is the most appropriate next step for management? Option A. Initiate a formal performance improvement plan based on the assessment results, outlining specific behavioral changes required within a defined timeframe. Option B. File the assessment results and monitor the employee's performance closely for any future deviations without direct discussion, assuming the results are predictive of future issues. Option C. Schedule a private meeting with the employee to discuss the assessment results, focusing on developmental opportunities and support strategies, while also reviewing current performance and seeking their perspective. Option D. Recommend immediate reassignment to a less client-facing role that requires less adaptability, based on the assessment's implications. The correct answer is C. Schedule a private meeting with the employee to discuss the assessment results, focusing on developmental opportunities and support strategies, while also reviewing current performance and seeking their perspective. Explanation. The scenario presents a professional challenge where an employee's performance on a Caliper assessment, a tool designed to evaluate personality traits relevant to job performance, raises concerns. Challenge lies in interpreting these results objectively and ethically, balancing the need for effective talent management with the protection of employee privacy and the avoidance of discriminatory practices. The assessment results, while indicating potential areas for development, are not definitive proof of misconduct or inability to perform. A nuanced approach is required to avoid jumping to conclusions or making decisions based on potentially biased interpretations. The correct approach involves a structured, multifaceted review that prioritizes objective evidence and fair process. This approach aligns with best professional practices by focusing on observable behaviors and performance metrics, rather than solely on assessment scores. It also emphasizes a supportive and developmental response, which is ethically sound and promotes employee growth. This aligns with principles of fair employment and talent development, ensuring that decisions are based on a holistic understanding of the individual's capabilities and potential, and are not unduly influenced by a single assessment tool. An incorrect approach would be to immediately take punitive action or make significant career-altering decisions based solely on the Caliper assessment results. This fails to acknowledge that such assessments are indicators, not absolute determinants, of future performance or suitability. It also risks violating ethical guidelines by potentially leading to unfair dismissal or demotion without sufficient corroborating evidence of poor performance or behavioral issues. Furthermore, it could be seen as discriminatory if the assessment's validity or applicability to the specific role is questionable, or if it leads to disparate impact on protected groups. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the results entirely, as this would fail to address potential performance issues that the assessment might have flagged, thereby neglecting the employer's responsibility to manage performance effectively and provide necessary support or interventions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the purpose and limitations of the Caliper assessment. This involves considering the assessment within the broader context of the employee's role, responsibilities, and actual job performance. The framework should include gathering additional objective data, such as performance reviews, feedback from supervisors and peers, and specific examples of work output. If concerns persist, a structured conversation with the employee, focusing on development and support, should be initiated. This process ensures that decisions are evidence-based, fair, and aligned with both organizational goals and ethical obligations.